The blood has a variety of functions. One of the main functions, obviously, is in transportation. So we can talk about transportation. So the blood has water in it, and the water is the solvent, and things are dissolved in that water. So when we look at what is transported in the water, we have the gases, the respiratory gases, like oxygen and CO2. They are dissolved in water first, and then they can be modified, and in the case of oxygen, they can be picked up by the respiratory pigment called hemoglobin. We also have nutrients that can be transported in the blood. And so, for example, glucose and amino acids are water soluble. We also have the ability to transport lipids, but the lipids have to be carried using a protein. So, for example, cholesterol can be transported in the blood, but it is transported via a lipoprotein. We can also talk about the transportation of hormones. Many hormones are actually proteins that can be dissolved in water, and some cases they are steroids, but then again, if they're a lipid-based, they can be bound to proteins, which makes them actually soluble in water. We also have in the blood clotting factors. And there are many of these. There's actually 13 different clotting factors that are produced by the liver and put into the blood. And these are super important because they determine when the blood is going to clot and when it should not clot. So we'll talk about some problems with blood clotting in the lectures this week. We also have things like ions. So for example, sodium and chloride, these are charged, and calcium. And these ions actually are the electrolytes of the blood, and they're super important in the function of the nervous system and the function of the muscular system. These ions are really important. And then we also have antibodies, and antibodies have another name. They are called immunoglobulins. So these are protective. They're globular proteins that are part of the immune system. They're not to be confused with antibiotics, but the antibodies are produced by specialized white blood cells called plasma cells, and these plasma cells produce this in response to infection. And so these are important. When we look at some other functions of the blood, we could talk about regulation. So one thing that the blood does is it helps in temperature regulation or thermoregulation. So for example, when you're hot and sweaty, the blood shunts itself to the surface of the skin for evaporative cooling. So an example of this is evaporative cooling. And then if you're extremely cold, then the blood actually gets shunt to the core of your body in order to protect the vital organs from being too cold. And so that shunting of the blood is important regulatory. We can also talk about the maintenance of proper pH. Maintenance of pH. And so your blood has buffers in it. One of the major buffers is carbonic acid. So this is carbonic acid. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the respiratory system. But what buffers do is they help to maintain a constant pH. So if for some reason your blood pH becomes too acidic and there's too many hydrogen ions, the buffers can actually remove those hydrogen ions from solution. And then if your body becomes, or your blood becomes too basic, it can do the same thing. So that maintenance of pH is an important homeostatic mechanism of the blood. We could also talk about maintaining proper fluid balance. Maintenance of fluid balance. So when we talk about water, water is in the blood, but it is also in the interstitial spaces. So that all of your cells are actually bathed in fluid. And so we need to be able to maintain that fluid balance. And part of the, or some of the blood proteins in your body help to do that. And so, for example, albumin is an important blood protein that is responsible for maintaining osmotic concentrations. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the circulatory system. We're going to talk about capillary exchange and how stuff is forced out of the capillaries, but then it is also picked back up by the capillaries. And so albumin, you might have seen this word before because this is actually the protein that is found in the egg whites. So albumin is also found in our blood. The last one we've already kind of touched on, and this is the idea that the blood is responsible for protection. And so the circulatory system can go everywhere in the body as it transports oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and wastes, for example. So it can actually be an important source of having your immune system be able to go everywhere as well. So we can have immune system integration here and transport throughout the body. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about the leukocytes and their function. And then we can also, we'll talk about clotting. Blood clotting helps to prevent blood loss.